Hello everyone, it is Mrs. Cooper and we are wrapping up our biogeochemical cycles. We are going to look at our last two. So our first one is the nitrogen cycle. And so we may be already familiar with nitrogen without realizing it. Nitrogen is commonly found in proteins, so we can think of foods with protein in them. And nitrogen is also found in the air that we breathe. So if we breathe in and breathe out, 78% of that air, of the atmosphere, right, the air we're breathing in, is nitrogen, which is great because we just said we need nitrogen to build proteins. But the nitrogen that we breathe cannot be used. It is the wrong form of nitrogen. And so our body just cannot process it. So even though we need the element nitrogen to survive, the type of nitrogen that we breathe in is in the wrong form, so we breathe it right back out. So the nitrogen cycle, the goal of it is going to be, yes, to show how matter is moving in a circle, but also to fix this problem. Fix, how can we take this unusable nitrogen and make it work for us? So here are the components. We've got our reservoirs, and then we have the diagram here. So the first thing we said is we have to fix this problem of how the nitrogen in the air is the wrong type. It's in the wrong chemical bonds. So the first step is going to be something called nitrogen fixation. I like to think it says fix. This is where we fix the problem. It's going to make the nitrogen gas usable. So this is happening because of bacteria. Maybe put a star there. There are bacteria in the soil and they can process the nitrogen. We can't, but they can. And they kind of change the way that the molecule looks. And so they take it from this unusable form to a usable form. And so that's good for us. So nitrogen fixation fixes the problem. And it allows the unusable nitrogen in the atmosphere to be converted to a usable state. And it's happening in the soil by bacteria. So that is what arrow B is showing us. Us taking nitrogen from the air and making it usable. Now it's great, right? The bacteria have done this, but how are we going to get it to other living things? So we have a two-step process. The first is assimilation. And this is where plants are going to take up this usable nitrogen from the soil. So we know that plants' roots might draw up water, but they're also going to draw up some minerals and nutrients. So they're going to pull up that nitrogen. And that's what we call assimilation. So let's see. Looks like maybe here's like our plant, right? So maybe this arrow here, arrow I, maybe just the first arrow I, is showing us how it's going from the soil to that getting pulled up by the roots. So we can say that that is I. But now that it's in a plant, how are we going to get it to other living things? That will be our next step of consumption. So consumers eat plants and then receive that nitrogen. So it could be that an herbivore eats a plant, or it could be that a carnivore eats another animal. So I think here we see J. That mouse is now eating the grass and getting the nitrogen. But remember, it's a cycle. What arrow is that? J. So let's write up J. It's a cycle, right? So we've brought in the nitrogen from the atmosphere via bacteria, making it usable, nitrogen fixation. It's moved to plants through assimilation, to animals through consumption. So now we have to bring it back to the soil. And so that will be our process of decomposition. Decomposition is going to be when nitrogen from waste, feces, decaying organisms is released back to the soil and kind of broken down. So I think we have a few arrows showing that process. Maybe this arrow E is showing us some waste products from the mouse. Maybe these mushrooms are representing a little bit of decomposition. So that would be arrow E. And then our last step is if we started with nitrogen as this unusable form in the atmosphere, we have to end with that as well. So we have one final step. It is denitrification. It is the opposite of nitrogen fixation. This is when bacteria, again, are going to take that usable form from the soil and put it back to the unusable oxygen or nitrogen back in the atmosphere. So we say it is the opposite of nitrogen fixation. And so let's see what that would look like with our arrows. So now that this nitrogen has gone back into the soil, we have bacteria added again. This is representing our bacteria. And it's going to be this whole arrow K, going to recreate that unusable form of nitrogen, and put it back into the atmosphere. So I guess that would be K and F, we'll say, F and K. Okay. So that is our process. We start with this unusable, moves to usable through nitrogen fixation. It moves to plants through assimilation, consumption, decomposition. It's back in the soil. And then our denitrification is going to return it back up to the atmosphere. And then again, we always talk about these reservoirs. So in this case, the reservoir where we're going to find most of our nitrogen is going to be the atmosphere. Of course, it's the wrong form for us, but that is where most of our nitrogen is going to be stored. All right, so I will post a screenshot of that. We are going to move on to our final biogeochemical cycle, and this is the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus is, again, going to be kind of found in proteins. It's going to be an important part of our cell membranes. So we definitely need phosphorus in our bodies, and we are going to be talking about, of course, how it's going to be cycling through the environment. And so what I kind of want to start with, maybe this time, is the reservoir. We find most of our phosphorus just in rocks. So that's why if we look at our picture, we see that we have a mountain range in the background. That is representing where most of the phosphorus is stored. So the first step is going to be figuring out how we can get the phosphorus out of that mountain, out of the rock. Unlike the other cycles, there is no atmospheric component, meaning there is no phosphorus gas. It is really only going to be in a solid state of matter. So instead of starting like we usually do in the atmosphere, we are going to be starting with where we find most of it, in a rock. And we're going to start with how we could release it from that. And so that is the process of erosion. So phosphorus that is found in rocks is going to be released by rain and weathering. So as the rain is maybe falling on the rock, it is slowly kind of breaking it down into sediments, and some of those sediments would be including phosphorus. So our erosion might be represented here by arrow H. Sorry, I think I said phosphorus. Our erosion would be represented by arrow H because we see rain is hitting the mountain and the phosphorus is running off. I think we could also maybe show it this time with arrow A. It's entering maybe a smaller pond as opposed to a larger body of water, but still erosion. So we can say A and H is showing that. All right, I added this one with our nitrogen cycle because we see a lot of repetition. Because now that we've released the phosphorus, we need some way for plants to kind of soak it up. And so we have the same term, assimilation again, with the same definition. This is how plants draw up nutrients. This time we're focusing on how they are drawing up or taking up phosphorus from the soil. In the nitrogen cycle, it was focusing on nitrogen, but it's the same process, pulling up it through its roots. So let's look at maybe our diagram again. Looks like maybe arrow B is showing this tree is pulling up some phosphorus, maybe from the water. Maybe we could say arrow C as well, showing maybe this is some type of flowering tree. So that's looking a lot like our assimilation, B and C. Okay. Just like last time, we also are going to need a way to transfer it from plant material to animal material. So that's our idea of consumption. Again, a repetition of the nitrogen cycle. Consumers eat plants and are going to receive the phosphorus. So let's see if we can see any evidence of that in our diagram. Looks like arrow maybe D and E. Shows maybe this deer is grazing on the plants and is now getting all of that phosphorus. So we can say D and E. And then our final one will be kind of the reverse of erosion. So we haven't really done blue. So we know that phosphorus, we started in a rock, we broke it down through erosion, went to plants through assimilation, went to animals through consumption. We want to return it back to that solid rock state. And so that would be rock formation, where phosphorus over time, with a lot of time and with a lot of pressure, can return or turn back into rock. So eventually, as those sediments recompile and have pressure forcing them together, we can get back to our rock formation. This step would take a significantly longer period of time than the others, but we are going to kind of represent many arrows showing that. So arrow F showing how the phosphorus is maybe returning back to the water, maybe same thing with G, and then J representing kind of how it's going to go back up and be part of that mountain again. So we can say F, G, and J maybe. Okay. So that is it for our biogeochemical cycles. I'm hoping that we are able to see the similarities between nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. We had a lot of similar terms there, and so we're going to also have a chance to do some practice as well. So thanks for listening, guys.